Welcome to the Cannabis Cultivation and Science Podcast. I'm your host, Tad Hussey of Kiss Organics. This is the podcast where we discuss the cutting edge of growing from a science-based perspective and draw on top experts from around the industry to share their wisdom and knowledge. My guest this week is Dr. Abby Wick. Abby is a North Dakota State University Extension Soil Health Specialist and Associate Professor and has experience working with farmers on soil health building practices like incorporating cover crops into rotation and transitioning to no-till systems. Since 2012, she has had her hands in over 50,000 acres of soil and influence management on over 200,000 acres of farmland in the Northern Plains just with the personal relationships she's developed with farmers. There are many other farmers she influences through her bi-weekly magazine articles and television segment, along with a discussion-based extension programming. She focuses on goal-oriented approaches so that farmers can maximize the benefits while reducing the risk associated with incorporating new practices. She has been featured in Successful Farming Magazine Q&A and bonus sections for her work with cover crops and ability to connect with farmers. She was also Senator Hoeven's selection to represent North Dakota for the Senate Ag Republicans' Women in Agriculture campaign in 2018. Now on to the show. Hi, Abby. Thanks for coming on the show today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm excited to talk to you about soil and soil health today. Can we start off telling people a little bit about your background?
Yeah, I am an associate professor and also an extension soil health specialist at North Dakota State University. So I've been here 8 or 9 years, kind of working with farmers, working with our county extension agents, also programs like with the NRCS or the soil conservation districts to get some of these soil health practices better understood and then implemented on farm here in North Dakota. So that's kind of what I've been doing now. I have I guess I've lived all over the country. I got my training in Wyoming. I was at Virginia Tech prior to coming to here, worked in Colorado for a bit and grew up in Ohio. So I feel like I've been around quite a bit, just looking at soils and always interested in soils. And it was kind of fitting that I ended up here working with farmers because it's a lot of fun. And I really, really enjoy working in soil health in this area.
So what aspect of soils or soil health do you feel like you fit into most strongly? I know when we talked before, you mentioned that you work with a team of people, and everyone sort of has their specialty. You have a soil biologist and a few other folks that you work with. What's your sort of niche in all of this?
Oh gosh, I try to fit in wherever the farmers need me, and I was pretty fortunate when NDSU started this soil health program. Gosh, 8 or 9 years ago, they hired 6 different positions. And so I'm the lead extension for the state here on main campus. And there's a researcher, Kaylee Gash, who is a soil ecologist. And so she runs the research program for the state. She specializes in all those microbes in the soils and soil carbon and organic matter, nutrient cycling, soil biogeochemistry. I mean, she's really specialized in a lot of different things, but mainly, having to do with the soil ecology. And then there's some other, one of the other specialists here that's up in Langdon, he does the salts. So we have fairly young soils geologically, and so we have a lot of salinity and also sodicity. So we're managing salts that are reducing our crop productivity here. So he kind of specializes in that. And then we've got a fertility person and then also a wildlife biologist, which is kind of neat that they saw that perspective of soil health as far as how it influences wildlife. So pretty diverse team. We've also had one that was, he was working up in Minot, and he has since moved to be the director of one of our research extension centers. But it's been a good program. I kind of fit in, with the keeping my finger on the pulse of what farmers need or want to learn about or apply to their farms. And then I try to direct the program in that way. So yeah, I don't know. It's hard to say what I truly specialize in, but I love like soil aggregates or something I've worked a lot with, in-field assessment of soil health and what are we seeing? How do we choose practices that fit our goals on farm, which may be different for every single field that the farmer works with. So yeah, I don't know. I just kind of float around and try to make sure that the program stays relevant and is answering farmers' questions.
Yeah. So when you step onto a new field and you see, their soil, what's going on mentally in your head in terms of the steps of sort of evaluating that soil?
The first thing when we step into a field, and I love doing this with the farmer, is hearing the history of the field from them, getting their take on what they need to accomplish in that field and maybe how soil health is going to help them get there. In some cases, we go into a field and a farmer may just say, I've tried everything else and what have I got to lose? And trying soil health practices. So sometimes they're open to anything because we sometimes go into their worst field that they have on the farm that they've deep ripped it, they've chisel plowed it, they've, done all these different practices trying to get that soil into shape for planting. And now they're thinking, well, why not try reducing tillage? Why not try something like cover crops? So we usually have that conversation first and, find a little bit about their logistics of their operation. What can they do with the time that they have? I mean, we're working with farms here that are, 1,500 acres to 40,000 acres. So fairly large operations. And do they have the manpower to seed a cover crop or to run a strip till machine and the expertise to do that? So, we kind of look at the logistics, and then I kind of like to see what the farmer thinks of the soil first. Do they think that it's healthy? Do they think it's pulverized? Do they, what's their take on it? And then we kind of talk through it before I tell them anything about what I think of their soils. We kind of talk through what they think of their soils. And then I'm kind of sneaky in a way. I kind of slip in different ideas and I let the farmers kind of come to their own conclusions. So yeah, that's kind of what's going through my head is how am I going to learn about this field, their operation, and what they want to do with this field before we even really start talking soils.
Yeah, I would think as a farmer, they're probably hyper fixated on nutrients, and this is just pure speculation. How often do you find a particular nutrient to be the limiting factor of growth, or do you find I don't know, something to do with the physical, makeup or aggregation of the soil to be limiting crop health?
That's a great question. And I think, the fertility is definitely, one of the primary concerns, what's limiting in that system. And, oftentimes though, when, if a farmer, especially as an independent crop consultant or somebody they're working with on their acres, they've probably identified that issue, or they've looked into the NDSU research or something like that. And they've kind of figured out that it's a sulfur deficiency or, something like that that's causing their crop to not perform, I guess. And so that seems to be the part of soils that farmers can really wrap their heads around, or they have the resources to address already. And the soil health stuff is just a little bit more fuzzy because it's a little less understood, and it's so based on the soil biological component and how that interacts with the chemistry of the soil and the physical properties. And so sometimes it's harder for farmers to pinpoint the issues that are associated with soil health. But, when we start talking about it, I'll ask them about, how's your trafficability at planting? Can you get your tractor across this field, or what's it like when you're planting? Or at harvest, do they have issues if it's a wet harvest or a late harvest, getting their combine across the field? And so a lot of it just comes down to, how's their equipment going across that field? And then we can kind of back that into relating it to soil aggregation as being the structure in that soil that holds up your equipment, or the water management part of it that says, if you're using water in the soil with something like a cover crop or a longer season crop, how's that influencing the way the water dynamics of this field? And how's your water move into the soil? So I think, I always try to kind of go back to, especially with soil health, because it can be so difficult to kind of, learn and understand as to how is your performance on this field, with your crop, but also with your equipment, because we can relate so many of those things back to soil health and how's that soil holding up that equipment or managing the water in that field.
That's really interesting. I think that your comments really highlight how complex of a system soil health is, and also how that relates to each farmer's unique situation. I would think even with similar soils, just with different water management and different equipment, or different crops, you could have wildly different outcomes in terms of yields and I guess farmer satisfaction.
Yeah, I mean, it is so based on that because, there are farmers that we have some very sandy soils in North Dakota, and some farmers are raising corn on those sandy soils. And well, corn's a long season crop, and most of the times it runs out of moisture. But you see a farmer across the road shifting to something like a pea crop. And so the peas go in early, they come off early before the moisture is limiting. And there's just two totally different management approaches just in the crop that you select for that field. So yeah, it is pretty interesting. It's so customized. And I think that's why these conversations in the field, with farmers and kind of an outside perspective or just somebody else looking at their field with them is really important to identifying some of these approaches that can be used.
So, you've touched on cover crops a little bit in relation to some of their benefits. Can we talk a little bit about that? Some of the things that cover crops add to a field in regards to, fertility, biomass, some of those sorts of things.
Yeah. We're in North Dakota, or I am. You're not. You're in some place probably much nicer in the winter. But in North Dakota, we have a really short growing season. Our crops pretty much are the main thing that's growing during that season, and then we have this long winter. So we have a pretty limited amount of time to get something to grow, to do a job for us. And so oftentimes with cover crops, which, are our management tool to grow something between your cash crops, between, planting and harvest or interseeding it into those cash crops is pretty challenging for us. So we do end up doing a ton of planting a cover crop into a cash crop, harvesting that cash crops, and then that cover crop is already established and it starts growing. And we get a few extra weeks of growth because of doing that approach. So we're always trying to find new ways to do things. And we have very few cover crops that actually overwinter in our winters here. So our basic tools for overwintering are cereal rye or winter rye. And this also is winter camelina oilseed that we're kind of looking into and exploring here. Whereas other places like Maryland, they can get clovers to overwinter because the winter is mild. And, sometimes the clover seeds that come out of Oregon, they say, well, they'll do well. They're winter hardy, and we get them here and it's like dead as a doornail right in the spring by the time spring comes. So we kind of, we have a limited window. We need to pick things that fit well with our cash crops in rotation, which we have dozens of cash crops that we grow here in North Dakota. So trying to fit them into those, the planting time and harvest time of those, and to make sure we don't transfer diseases between cover crops and cash crops, and just kind of making sure that it works for the farmers with their herbicide applications too. So it gets pretty tricky pretty fast. But we have some just basics that we go to of cereal rye, radish has worked really well up here. Oats work great, winter wheat, spring wheat. We just kind of go to those basics. Turnips, if you're grazing them with livestock, we'll recommend some of that. And flax has been really good for us too, because a lot of farmers here have grown flax. So to put it in a cover crop mix is just fine for them because they feel like they can manage it. So we try to choose things that are easy, that kind of do the job, and then we figure out how to get it going in a cash crop by interseeding it versus waiting till harvest because we just don't have time after harvest here.
So, with cover crops, it sounds like there's a lot of different options, and it really depends on what the farmer's goals are. If I miss any of these benefits, please jump in. Cover crops can work to help with weed management. They can help with water management. They can help with reducing erosion. They can help with increasing your organic matter in soils on scale. You can't just bring in compost if you have 1,500 acres that you're managing. That's just not very practical in a lot of cases, I would think. What are some of the other potential benefits of cover crops in terms of targeted goals?
Yeah, I think, for us here, erosion is a big one. And I think keeping those fields covered, especially after low residue crops of For us, soybeans are pretty low residue crop. Peas are low residue. So getting something growing there to protect those soils from erosion is usually number one on our list. The water management, having something over winter like that cereal rye or winter camelina that can use water both in the fall and the spring can really help us here too. Or, building up a residue with something like oats that can reduce evaporation from the surface and actually retain some moisture in those soils is pretty important. And, the weed control like you're talking about is excellent for us too. We're starting to get different resistant weeds up here. And so having that early spring growth of an overwintering cover crop competes with weeds and can help give farmers a little extra time to get out there and manage the weeds on that field. And then, like you mentioned, the increasing organic matter is a big deal for us, especially in our sandy soils. We do have some composting that occurs around here, but you have to be close to a dairy. And like you said, the logistics of getting it on a lot of acres can be pretty challenging. One of the things that seems like a pretty hot topic for a lot of farmers or interesting cover crops is this, this catch and release idea that cover crops take up nitrogen and then they release them for next year's crop. And we're not seeing a lot of that here. It's pretty complex, like we were talking about before, the soils are complex. And, if we oversimplify them to think that we can grow a cover crop, it'll take up nutrients, which they do. We've measured that, and they do take up those excess nutrients in the soil, but then assume that they're going to release them when a crop needs it the next year is a pretty big assumption. And we're not seeing those nutrients released for several years. It's being bound up in that organic material, and it's not being released for a cash crop in the short term of 4 to 5 years. And that's okay, right? It's still in the soil. At least it hasn't been lost from the system. But I think there's some of those benefits have been oversimplified a little bit, and we just need to kind of fine tune that. But that is one that farmers are interested in because they want to reduce fertilizer costs and get it down to more manageable return on investment for each acre.
So when you reference that, I think immediately of clover when we talk about nitrogen fixing legumes and the bacteria that fixes atmospheric nitrogen. But what you're saying is that you're not actually seeing that in a form that the plant can access as quickly as you would have thought, but you're not losing it too. I know we touched on this in another conversation. Can you kind of elaborate on that a little bit?
Sure. Yeah, so clovers are really popular for nitrogen fixers, and we're, North Dakota, they don't fare very well for us because we need 60 days of growth on clover as a cover crop to actually offset the high cost for the seed. And most of the times we don't get 60 days of prolific growth to really offset it. So we use some other legumes in our system, peas or faba bean or something like that's a little more cold tolerant and does a little bit better as far as growth. And so, you've got the nitrogen fixers doing that, and what can you expect from those? And then you have the other ones that capture nutrients, the radish or oats or, any other basically living cover crop is going to capture some of those nutrients and hang on to it. And we're just, when you have decomposition of that organic material in that plant, you have to have the right temperature and the right moisture for the microbes to work on that organic material and to release it for plants. And oftentimes when our crops need that, those microbes may not be as active as we need them to be to release some of those nutrients. And they might go after different forms of organic material in the soil and maybe not going after those cover crop forms. I don't know how you'd even measure that, but we're also, so it's a timeliness thing. It may not be ready. The conditions might not be right for those microbes to be releasing that nutrient to the crop when it needs it. But then also we've got these shrink swell soils here, these high clay soils that we're seeing some of those nutrients get caught between the clay layers, which is getting even more complex, right? This is soils, maybe that's the theme of this whole thing, is soils are complex. But we're finding some of those nutrients get actually caught between the clay layers and they don't get released for the plants to use them. So there's all kinds of places that these nutrients are going or being stored in the soils, and we just don't know kind of when they're going to be released yet, whether it's from a nitrogen fixing cover crop or one that just captures nitrogen in the soils. So we're working on it. We'll try to figure it out when we can. But right now we just tell farmers to put on, whatever rate of fertilizer you need, do a check strip on the side with the full rate of fertilizer, and then come back and side dress with nitrogen if you feel like it's deficient. And if it's not, then the organic matter is turning over, then you're good. You save some money.
Okay, but you're not seeing that nitrogen leach out either then necessarily. You're saying that it's still there, it's just not accessible.
Right. Yep, that's exactly it. We're not seeing it leached, but we're also not seeing it become available.
That's so interesting because,
somewhere.
Everyone in their heads, they think clover, nitrogen, and you just assume it's going to be available. But it sounds like you said, the microbes, temperature, sunlight, crop timing, all of these things actually make it quite a complex process.
Yeah, I think so. It's it's not just this catch and release, or I'm going to plant clover in my corn so that it fixes nitrogen for my corn. Some of it's just that these nitrogen fixers are really beneficial because their dead material is so highly desirable by microbes that it stimulates the system. There's some leakiness happening there with the nitrogen coming out of the roots and whatever else, but a lot of it's just that material, that dead material of a legume is just really desirable for microbes to decompose. So yeah, I think there's been some oversimplification of these systems that I think, makes it challenging. I understand that, not every farmer needs to be like a super soil microbiologist, or into soil biogeochemistry to manage these things. But I think there are just some things we need to be aware of to make sure that we're, getting the most out of our crop in each field, and not relying too much on some of these practices or ideas that we can catch it and then release it using a cover crop.
Yeah, that is one other benefit of cover crops that you touched on there that I didn't mention before, and that's sort of microbial health in soils, and how bare soils just don't fare well compared to soils that have plants in them. And I think that having roots available, these microbes obviously increases your microbial health. We had talked about how microbes get oversimplified too, to things like fungal to bacterial ratios as a tool, and that your research there found that wasn't as useful, I believe. Can you touch on that a little bit too?
Sure. Yeah, microbial health is extremely important, and we try to focus on that, right? And we try to measure it, right? We're humans. We want to measure everything and know if it's working or not, or what we have. And with microbes, it's just tough to do that. And so, like you brought up that fungal to bacterial ratio, there's been a ton of emphasis put on that. And, I know how they do it. It's all these phospholipid fatty acid analyses, or PLFA. And you send the sample off to a lab, you pay whatever and get the sample back, and it tells you you've got this type of bacteria and this type of actinomyces, or just generalizations of like gram-positive bacteria or gram-negative bacteria, or, this is how much fungal hyphae you have in your system. And then they create this ratio of fungi to bacteria. And if you're only sending off one sample from one point in time, it's just going to tell you about that point, that location where you pulled the sample at that moment. It's not telling you about the whole system, or what that looks like across the field, or the variability that may exist, or any of those things. And so we've run, thousands of samples, and it's like the variability is just huge with that analysis. And it doesn't mean that it's not worthwhile, but it also means that if you're sending off one sample and you're going to make, huge management decisions based on this analysis of one sample from one point in time on your field, that's pretty risky. And it's not something that we're prepared for farmers to be doing or to be interpreting, really. Sometimes I look at that data and I'm like, geez, I don't know what that means. So yeah, I think it's just, using the general practices of reducing tillage, to create a home for these microbes and these diverse microbes to exist. Giving them a food source, right, with with your cash crop and your diverse rotation, and then adding in some cover crops to fill in the gaps, and have something growing. Food and shelter is number one for these guys. So just kind of creating that habitat for them is probably the most important thing you can do. And then just make the assumption that they're there and that they're diversifying and that new microbes are coming in that maybe weren't as prevalent before. And they're all kind of interacting as this community under the soil surface and hopefully doing the job that you need them to do.
So what I'm hearing is that test doesn't necessarily give you a lot of actionable data. Because you're going to be trying to do things in terms of like best practices for microbial health and soil health anyway. And the diversification that you see, I mean, the standard deviation that I've seen on these tests can be so wide that I look at them and kind of scratch my head and say, how can I really use this, or does this allow me to make any changes in my garden or in my field? And I just don't see it as a tool at this point. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, I agree with you. I wouldn't make any, management decisions on these biological tests, at this point, because they're so variable and they depend on when you pull the sample and where you pull the sample and how many samples you pull. And, I think it's neat stuff to know. But I think a lot of this, you can just make these assumptions. And I know people get freaked out about assumptions because you're not collecting the actual data or, something like that. But we have collected the data. We've run all these soil health analyses on, one field. We had 180 points across that field, and we sampled it multiple times and looked at these things. And it's just, you learn as much about your field and the health of your field by using a shovel as you ever could by running all these analyses. And so sometimes it's neat to know and you can use it as a baseline, but I certainly wouldn't make management decisions based on that, on a fungal to bacterial ratio or, any of those things at this point. We're just not there yet. And we'll get there maybe, but in the meantime, it's just good to know that you're creating a good home for microbes. You're covering your field and reducing erosion. You may be getting better trafficability. Whether it's a garden or a field, you can see these changes that are occurring as you build up your soils, and maybe it's just good to be happy with that.
Yeah, I like that. I guess for me with the microbes, I kind of feel like you said, like let's just take on best practice. I'm not convinced we'll ever fully understand it because it's such a complex process, and I'm not sure that we necessarily need to ever completely understand it. But I do think that it's an interesting thing to continue to explore. But one of the things is like if you have a fertilizer application, if it rained recently, if it hasn't rained, all of these things are going to affect your microbial populations pretty quickly, to where I think it would be really hard to make, like you said, a long-term decision.
Yeah, I like that. I like that approach. So you're just kind of looking at what management practices you're using. Are they achieving some goals? And maybe the microbes are just kind of coming along with it, and you're getting those benefits as you go.
Yeah. So jumping around a little bit here, I kind of want to move back to cover crops because we talked a little bit about the benefits of them, but we didn't really touch on all of the complexities. Like when you talk to a farmer, it sounds like the first thing you're looking at is their goals. So like, can you give an example of like a situation with a particular cover crop in terms of a farmer's goals and how you would meet that?
Yeah, let's see. So maybe we've got some crazy high clay soils here, but they're pretty specific to our region. So maybe I'll talk about some sandy soils where, I came in a little bit after the fact on this one. The farmer is already doing these great things because he's got a crop consultant that's very interested in soil health and very good at making recommendations there. So there's a farmer over by Jamestown, North Dakota, and he's got some very sandy soils that he works with. And it's kind of like the tale of two fields. So he has one field that he's been managing with no-till for 15 to 18 years probably, added in cover crops to that system, changed his rotation on it to grow shorter season crops to be better suited for those sandy soils. So, for example, corn and soybean would be, kind of king here in North Dakota in that area. That would be the rotation. Well, he grows wheat on that field, so it comes off a little earlier. He grows peas on that field, so again, gets in early, comes off early, and gives him a chance to plant a cover crop in that field. And so he started doing that. He'd follow it with like an oat cover crop or something, so it'll winter kill, and he doesn't have to worry about it using too much moisture in the spring. Throws in a little radish, some flax, lets some of the volunteer from the cash crop come back, and he gets pretty much another growing season out of that field. And what he's doing with that is that he's increasing his organic matter. He's not only he's increasing organic matter so that it holds more moisture in those sandy soils, but then he's also getting better cover on that field going into the winter to reduce erosion. And so he's been doing this stuff for a while and, happy with the performance on his fields. Well, he took over a new half section of land, kind of kitty corner to that field, the same soil types. And that field had been corn and soybean, and it had been chisel plowed and ripped and whatever else. And so he started farming that. First thing he put on it was a short season crop like peas, followed it again with a cover crop to get that organic matter built up. And that first year, we grabbed some soils from his existing field where he'd been using these practices for 15 or more years, and grabbed some soils from that new field he took over and just put them side by side to look at soil color. And the practices he had been using with the reduction of tillage, the incorporation of cover crops, the changing of his crop rotation, his soils that he'd been managing for a long period of time were much darker than those in the other field he had just taken over. And so that tells you there's more organic matter, and he's probably getting better moisture retention on those fields, especially in a drought like we are in this year. He's probably got the moisture there that he needs to get that crop going. And he was pretty happy. He hadn't ever looked at those two soils side by side. And it was kind of, for him, it was like, okay, well, now I know that what I've been doing is working, and I can just kind of see it visually. So he's doing the same practices on that other field to get it back in shape. So that would be, one example of where some of those changes have really made a difference for a field, and kind of evaluating it too. But I think that's pretty common when farmers change the system and suit it to those soils. I think it can make a big difference in how those soils perform.
Yeah, what do you see when farmers first start making changes like this? Let's say you had a farmer who was farming fairly conventionally, a lot of soil disturbance, a lot of chemical fertilizers. How does that look switching over in terms of cost and also yields as they make a change? Because I'm making the assumption that you have a farmer, they really worked the land, the soil is fairly depleted, they're seeing their yields go down and down and down, and then they finally reach out to you and say, Abby, help me fix this. Like, what can we do? What does that look like?
Boy, it looks, again, different for every farm, but in general, most of them have the equipment to no-till, right? I mean, their seeders and their planters can all perform well in residue.
Can you, before you go any further, can you explain what that means on an agricultural level? Because I think that a lot of people that listen to this podcast don't know what no-till and minimal till really means agriculturally, because it's a little different, I think, terminology, I guess, in that regard.
Oh, good. Yeah, thanks for that. So no-till for us is, just not making a tillage pass with a chisel plow or, anything like that in the fall or the spring. And so literally when you harvest that crop and leave that residue behind the combine, that's what you're going to plant into the next spring. You're not going to disturb it at all with any kind of tillage. There's also kind of these, ideas of using vertical tillage, which is another management tool. So it's not as disturbing of the soil as like a chisel plow would be, which, goes several inches into the soil, but a vertical tillage would be, goes maybe 2 inches in the soil, and it just slices and sizes residue. And so farmers will use that practice generally, in the spring before planting, if they feel like they left that field, we're going to try to go to no-till, but the residue just, they're going to not get a good stand with their equipment. So they'll run this tillage tool prior, called vertical tillage, and they'll kind of size up that residue and create something they can plant into a little bit better. And then there's strip till, which some farmers use here, which is a whole different expensive piece of equipment, but it creates strips in that field where you're going to plant your cash crop. And so generally you do that the fall before, and you get your fertilizer down in those strips, and you're only disturbing a third of the soil. So you've got the tillage happening where you're planting a crop, and then in between you're leaving residue, similar to like a no-till situation where you have good residue cover between, but you've got these berms or these strips that you're going to plant into that would be like chisel plow. So it's really kind of a hybrid type tillage practice. So that's, kind of what farmers would be looking at. There's all kinds of other variations on this, but those are kind of the general, no-till, reduced tillage, which would be kind of that vertical till, and then strip till.
Okay. Yeah. So that's helpful. So you're trying to reduce that. When are instances where you may encourage tilling? Does that occur?
Yeah. I mean, there's, on a wet harvest or something, I mean, farmers may cause some ruts in their field, whether they're no-till or full tillage. Sometimes you have to get the crop off and it's wet and the equipment gets stuck, or you leave some tracks or something in the field, and you don't have to work the whole field or do the whole, till the whole field to get it back in shape. But if you don't want to keep driving over those ruts for the next 10 years, you need to go in and level them off with something, and kind of get that soil back to where, you can harvest, with your header close to the ground and not catch dirt or ruts or, something like that. And also, I mean, yeah, farmers don't want to be bounced around in their equipment all the time. So that's where I recommend tillage, mostly is if you have some ruts in the field from a wet harvest or wet planting or something like that, and you need to get them out, then that's an appropriate time to do tillage. I always ask farmers if the tillage they're doing, what is the reason for that tillage? If they can identify a specific reason to do that tillage and can, a specific timing for it, I think it's important to ask yourself that every time to make sure it doesn't become a habit and something that you're just doing because you've been doing it a while, or, is the field too wet to plant in the spring and you need to do a vertical tillage pass, then do it. But if the field is dry the next spring and you're out there doing a vertical tillage pass and you've lost that original reason for why you're doing it, then maybe you don't need to be doing it at that point. So, I think it's always good for farmers to kind of check back in with why they're doing something on their farm. And, if they can't identify the reason anymore, then maybe they don't need to be doing it.
Yeah, I could see where you do just get into a habit of treating your soil the same every year, or your land. What about if you have residue that's just not breaking down fast enough, if the microbes aren't, breaking down whatever cover crop you'd run through the winter, come planting time? What do you do in scenarios like that?
That would be, I suppose that would be something that you could run a vertical tillage pass over or something. If you feel like you've got a lot going on out there and a lot to plant into, then yeah, you may decide to do a vertical tillage pass and kind of knock it back and size it a little bit. And that would be okay. But before even doing that, I encourage farmers to get their planter out there and do a couple strips into it and just see what it's like to plant into. Sometimes when you look at a field, you think it's going to be a mess, but then you get out in it and your equipment does really well, or you're not even seeding anything, but you're just running your equipment through to see how it performs. I think that's okay too, and maybe you don't need to incur that cost of doing some kind of, additional pass. So I'm always kind of encouraging farmers to try something first. And if it doesn't work, then come back in with that, whatever tillage pass or adjustment or something, but give it a shot first and see how it goes, and then kind of adjust from there.
Yeah. So all that residue is, little fertilizer bags and little water retention holders for you, I would say. What about the risk of disease, though? Potentially having more fungal issues or things or bacteria as those residues are breaking down.
Definitely a concern,
or pest habitat,
right?
I guess, too. Yeah.
Yeah, you're changing the whole system, right? So the diseases and pests that you may have had or weeds, with full tillage are not going to be the same as in a reduced till or a no-till situation. So, I mean, gosh, you can look at things like Goss's wilt in corn. That's, transferred on residue, I believe. Hopefully I'm not wrong on that. I keep trying to remember all these different disciplines I work with, and sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. So if I'm wrong, let me know. But that can be an issue, right? I mean, if you have that bacteria on that residue living there and you go to the crop the next year and it transfers over, that can be an issue. Or you can have diseases transfer between cover crops. So for us, radish is also a host for clubroot, which is a huge problem in canola production. So, it's, you have to be careful of those things. As you change your system, you're changing your management. And for sure, like weeds, in a full tillage system, they're kind of an annual weed issue. And then you go to no-till and it's a perennial weed issue. And so you're spraying at different times and, trying to figure out how to manage those weeds in different ways. So it's definitely something to keep in mind that if you change one part of your system, you're probably going to change a lot of parts of that system. And just be prepared for it and keep your eyes open to it. And talk with other people who have made that transition because they know what to expect, or at least to give you something to watch out for. But yeah, I think a lot of the, failures that we see in people going to like no-till, for example, is that they just stop tilling, but they forget to use the water after a wheat crop with a cover crop, or they forget to do different herbicide passes, or change their rotation, things like that. That's where we see those things fail because they're taking one practice and not treating it as a system and then adjusting, the entire system for it.
So it's not as simple as just not tilling your field and then treating everything the same. Yeah.
Right. I think we would call that direct seeding, right? Where, you're just doing everything the same and you just kind of plant into it, and it's not a system at that point. It's just a practice. And so, I think, anyone making changes or doing something new, they need to treat it as a system and figure out what they can do to make that system work, especially for different soil types. So, it sounds really complex, and you hate to make it complex before somebody even tries it, but it's certainly, you hate to see failures also.
Yeah, so as someone, and I got you off topic, this is my fault when we started talking about tilling. As someone makes this transition to sort of this soil health perspective, we talked about switching from a, very conventional agricultural model to something that's, looking at soil health and reduced tillage and things like that. What do you typically see? And I know every situation is going to be different, but what do you see in terms of yields? Is that first year sort of a little bit of a transition, and then over time, as that soil improves, do yields typically go up? What does that look like?
You're right. It looks different for everybody. And you often hear with, if I'm going to go to no-till, I'm going to take a yield hit for X number of years, and that's just kind of the general idea of it. And how do I prepare for that? And I always remind farmers to look back at what's their return, their ROI, what's their return per acre? Are they doing, swapping a tillage pass for herbicide pass, or, what are they doing that's going to change those costs? And all the way down to labor and maintenance of your equipment, or hours on your tractor, or what it costs you to have a specific person out in the field doing a specific job. I want them to kind of look at all those different things and then decide if it's a success or not. Because oftentimes, the farmers I work with, for example, I mean, they would love to have a 200 bushel corn yield on their field, right? I mean, that would be kind of average, and they'd be perfectly happy with that. And some years they do get that. Sometimes they get 220 bushels, but sometimes their yield goal, or what they want to achieve, is 190. And if they can consistently get that based on their inputs and the way they manage that field for corn, then they're happy because they're having reductions in fertilizer inputs. They're kind of feeling that out to see how much they can cut back on fertilizer additions, and that could be a huge cost saving. So maybe they're only getting 190 bushel corn, and the neighbor's getting 210. But if they're applying less fertilizer, they have less passes, they're using different management approaches, then it might just be that they're coming out ahead, cash-wise on that field.
That's a great point. So we've kind of covered how complex not just soil health is, but also just farming in general, and a lot of this. What are some resources out there for farmers. I know you have this website. Can you talk a little bit about some of the resources that you guys offer for people?
Oh, absolutely. I'd love to. So we have, NDSU Soil Health. If you search that anywhere, you'll find our webpage, which is ndsu.edu/soil health. And, the things that I focus on providing to farmers are mainly videos, because they can check those videos out while they're in the tractor and the combine, and generally they're less than 3 minutes, so you can watch it in one pass on a quarter of land. It takes you about less than 3 minutes to get across the field. So they can watch videos. We also have a podcast called Soil Sense, and also a Soil Sense Field Check. And so we try to kind of highlight the things that farmers are doing, the research that's being done, kind of different places that you'll find soil health and those collaborations that make it work. So we've got some episodes there. And then we did like this field check podcast that was a 10-minute episode with a question and answer type format. So you can get a lot of information in a very short period of time as well. And then I'd love to host meetings. So we've got a ton of meetings coming up and workshops. And now with everything, being virtual last year and now going back to face this year, everybody wants a hybrid event. So we're doing some virtual and some, with face-to-face components, and just, the complexity too of our programming has gone way up, but in a good way, because it just allows a lot better access. So all that stuff can be found on that NDSU Soil Health webpage, and you can just probably get lost in there in a rabbit hole.
There's a ton of information on here. It's quite impressive. One question I had: can anyone join these sorts of things? You don't have to be a farmer in North Dakota to utilize, some of these more some of these resources that are more interactive, like the events, I guess, for instance.
Oh yeah, we love having people from all over join them. A lot of it is going to be kind of geared towards the farmers because that's our general audience, but there's so much that you can pick up on. Not everything would make sense sometimes. Like say you're not, you're just getting exposed to agriculture or something like that, but you can pick things up. I mean, when I started my job here at NDSU 9 years ago, I didn't know a combine from a tractor. I had never really set foot on a farm. And so I'm always kind of keeping that in mind, that there's a lot of people like me that want to learn about agriculture and maybe don't have the chance to, but if you're listening to episodes on farmers and their stories and how they're working with neighbors to achieve these practices, or you're learning from some of the researchers or the extension people, we're pretty good at trying to share these messages in different ways for different audiences. So I would encourage anyone to hop onto these events, and I usually try to keep them fun and entertaining because there also has to be that kind of element to it. It can't just be all a bunch of eggheads, talking about soil nerd talk and whatever. So we try to keep them fun and entertaining. And you know what, if most of them are free. So if you get onto the event and you're like, this is not what I thought it would be, you can always just get off and it costs you nothing. So that's kind of the other good thing about it too, is a lot of flexibility.
Yeah, I'm looking at some of the topics here on your soil health page, and you have one on, a quick video on incorporating cover crops, building soil health, grazing cover crops. There's a lot of really great topics on here. So I highly suggest folks check it out. Can you talk a little bit about what extension services offer for people in various states, and sort of what that really is for folks?
Yeah, I sure can, because I had no idea what extension was until I got my job here. So extension is it's the branch of the land grant institutions, right? So NDSU is the land grant institution here, like Ohio State would be for Ohio, Colorado State University for Colorado. And so they're the branch of the university that gets information out to farmers, but also to the public. And our job is to not necessarily do the research, but to use our colleagues who are doing the research to get that information repackaged and into a format where it can be used. And so any of those land grant institutions have this extension branch. And oftentimes, extension is, there's certainly a main campus presence. So there's faculty that do this kind of stuff. But like in North Dakota, we have county agents that are in every single county. And so they go out, they interact with farmers, with gardeners, with kids in 4-H and just the general public, and they're providing information all the time too. So if you live in a state where you have, county extension, you can sure give them a call and find out what they have to offer. I mean, it could even be that you have a disease on your trees and you need to know what it is, or a pest or something like that, and you can send a sample into your extension office and they can tell you what it is and how to manage it. So it's a really diverse organization, because it also, there's stuff in agriculture, but then there's all kinds of stuff in community as well, and building leadership skills at the community level, or food preparation, even for canning, and how do you do that and keep yourself safe. Skin cancer. I mean, there's all kinds of resources available through extension. So I really value this part of the universities. I think it's a great way for them to interact better with the community and with other people, and to just get the information out from this, these kind of ivory tower campuses. We got to get this information out somehow. So that's what extension does.
So it's sort of that bridging the gap between in-field farming and then academic research, I guess, is what I'm hearing.
Yeah. We're kind of if you look at the campus and the faculty on campus too, we're kind of the extroverts, and then you have the introverts that are the researchers. So we're the ones that like to be out chit-chatting and whatever about stuff, and getting to know people and sharing some of that information. So that's definitely how it works. There's different faculty for different jobs here, for sure.
So since this podcast is generally speaking to people who are growing, cannabis or hemp, what sort of resources or relationships might someone be able to form with a county extension in that regard? Because I realize, like in your case, you guys don't have a lot of hemp growers in North Dakota. I think you had said. But where do you think you might still be able to plug in and help someone if they reached out?
Oh gosh, we don't have a ton of hemp production up here. But the other thing with extension and with the university is that we're great for connecting people. And so, for example, if I don't know anything about hemp, right, and I have a farmer that wants to grow it, I know at least a consultant, and then also a researcher on campus that works with hemp. Or I also know somebody that was an agronomist that was, taking on CBD, hemp for CBD production, which I know very little about, but I know those people and I know how to reach them. And mm-hmm. So oftentimes, if the extension person doesn't have the answer on a specific thing, they can certainly find someone who does. And that's kind of what we specialize in, is our contact lists and our cell phones and who we can call to help you get the answers you need.
And I would add that you know soils really well, and a variety of crops in different soils that might, respond similar to hemp. And, I think you could also probably make a cover crop recommendation to at least get someone started in the right direction, or at least what to avoid as a cover crop based on your experience. So I think there's a lot there that you may be able to offer someone to at least get them pointed in the right direction as research grows on, this relatively new crop.
Yeah, I absolutely. And I think, I love learning about new crops too, and kind of problem solving. So that's certainly an area where we can help. And I mean, I was just at a vineyard the other day, and they want to do cover crops between the vines. And I was like, I don't know anything about vineyards other than I like to drink wine. So it's like, how am I going to make a recommendation on this? But I can sure listen to the issues and when they need something to flower or not flower, or attract pollinators, or, and then we can kind of come up with some solutions together. So I would think, it's the same deal with hemp, and how can we help manage even the residue on hemp? Because I understand it's pretty tough, right? So it's, how are you managing that? And, what's your rotation look like? Or, I think there's all kinds of ways that we can help. And in general, when you want to learn about something or you're curious, you seem to find the answer somehow.
Yeah. And I think your vineyard comment was really interesting, because I know when I visited some vineyards and got to speak to the people in charge of the soil and the fertility there, I learned a lot from them on how they manage grapes. It's so different than other crops. But then also coming with an outside perspective, I had all these things I kind of wanted to try, or at least look into, as someone who didn't come, traditionally trained in viticulture, which I think it allows for sort of a synergy of ideas and things like that too, as we talk about different systems and different crops.
Oh, absolutely. That's pretty cool. Yeah. I'm sure you brought a lot to the table, just,
I don't think I did in this case, but it definitely got my brain thinking gee, I'd love to try this or experiment with this, or, really dive in further and learn and see if there were things that we could, that we're trying in other crops that might make sense with this crop, or, vice versa. So.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, cool. Well, I really appreciate your time today. I had a lot of fun chatting with you, and I hope folks do check out some of these things. I mean, I'm looking at your Soil Sense page here. You have soil health on the farm, how to dial in fertility, precision of soil health, stuff on dealing with salts, building soil in cool and wet climates, like just so many great topics, and it's free. So I highly suggest people take a look.
Oh, thank you for that. I appreciate it.
Well, thanks for your time today, and I look forward to chatting in the future, and have a wonderful rest of the day.
All right. Thanks, you too.
All right. Bye. That was Dr. Abby Wick, and you are listening to the Cannabis Cultivation and Science Podcast. I'm your host, Tad Hussey of Kiss Organics. Don't forget to check out the podcast page at www.kisorganics.com for links to the websites and topics we covered in today's podcast. Just click on the Learn tab, then Podcast. Also, if you haven't already, please take a moment and leave us a comment or review on whatever platform you listen on. I do take the time to read them all and appreciate the feedback. You can also follow us on Instagram at KIS Organics to stay up to date on the latest podcast releases and information. Thanks for listening.